One of the most common refrains that those of us who've been caught in stings get from the general public and either well-meaning or the trolls who are not well-meaning is this. You guys are just trying to cover up for what you did wrong. Okay. And we know that, and that's all there is to it. We do get people who come on, either attorneys or police officers or whatever, or people who work in the legal establishment or corrections officers who will say, "Yeah, we've seen some of what you're talking about." But the vast majority of the time, we are kind of, if we're not attacked, we are asked to prove our cases very often. And it really sets up the dichotomy between police good guy and you guys, bad guys, perverts. And we've tried to dispel as much of that as we can. Obviously, if people are unwilling to look at facts, there's nothing we can do about that. But one of the things that is always missed in this is that when police officers are actually approached, I.C.A.C officers or independent people like today's guest in air quotes, Sheriff Shady Grady Judd of Polk County, Florida, where I actually lived in 1992 in Lakeland. That gives you pause there because Sheriff Grady, as well as some other sheriffs and law enforcement around, like the law enforcement down the street from me here, refuse to give any of their data that proves that they are not actually running sting operations where they're setting people up. In other words, what sort of chats are you doing? Give us examples of what you're doing. This is what we have found out. These are the examples of chats we have. Where are your chats we can compare? Where are your affidavits? Where are your court documents? Where are your subpoenas? And we ask this because as citizens, as taxpayers, whether it be Florida or Virginia or Texas or anywhere else in the country where this is currently under investigation by people, and it is all over the country, investigating the investigators, say the police, what we find is that the people who are not willing to come with clean hands, not willing to show all that they're doing and that they're not actually targeting people who are innocent are the police. They're the ones that consistently refuse to do that. And what are you going to say to that, except that the police feel that they are entitled, that they don't have to do it? And as Sheriff Grady does over and over again, when you go after him, he comes after you. Okay. Officers bend rules to boost sex sting totals. Well, this comes out of the Lakeland paper. Okay. The Ledger, Ledger. Officers bend rules to boost sex sting totals. Let's start here. Detectives are crossing the line. Well, look at the date on this. This is 2014. So August 9th, and this is part of a two-part series where you see law enforcement blurring the lines on due process. I'm just going to go through and look at some of these. 10 investigates, Tampa Bay 10, that according to this article, I guess this is the Tampa Bay one. There's a similar one from the Ledger. So, excuse me, 10 investigates out of Tampa, which I think is owned by, or at least was owned by the Gannett companies. We're finding that most of these men, excuse me, with mugshots paraded out by Sheriff Grady and others, who has never been shy about his press conferences and about abusing, mocking, insulting, humiliating people. Regardless, and when they've only been accused, by the way, they have not been adjudicated. What they found was that these people very often were simply minding their own business, looking for other adults when detectives started to groom and convince them to break the law. Okay. Many were under 25 and with sort of a delayed childhood that we seem to have in this age where more and more people are staying at home and they view themselves not as adults, but as children, old children. It is not uncommon for them to be interacting with much younger people. That's certainly true. However, what's happening is that the police are targeting them, you could argue, because many are consistently under 25 and certainly under 30. And police do the familiar bait and switch, right? We know that there's a 5-point program. We know that I.C.A.C deploys this as a strategy or a tactic, perhaps. They switch the bait, typically indicate that they're 14 or 15. And when they don't immediately disengage, okay, they are arrested, sometimes years later. Men start conversing with what they think are adults. Officers change the age, but try to convince the men to continue. Officers often begin the conversation, as I've said it, as I've stated, excuse me, many, many times. Okay. When Sheriff Grady was approached about this, and it was suggested that his detectives were over aggressive, Sheriff Grady does what he usually does. He says, the concern I have is that you inflate your investigative reporting to make it glitzy. In another case, he attacks the person who is going after him, claiming that they are just looking for attention, which is pretty funny for a guy who doesn't have any problem, any compunction about flinging himself in front of any microphone, camera, or lectern that he can possibly get in front of to bash, smash, attack, insult, humiliate, and blast the photograph and the address and of people who have still not had their day in court. Okay, these are some of the tactics used in the stings. See if these sound familiar that we report on Stinging Back or on my channel here, I.C.A.C Unpacked. The judges are saying this. It was the agent who repeatedly steered the conversation back to sexual activity with the minor, his decoy. The government made the effort to lure him into committing a crime. The undercover officer failed to follow I.C.A.C procedures, and the law does not tolerate government action to provoke a law-abiding citizen, to provoke a citizen to commit a crime. We call that entrapment. In one case, the judge used the language of I.C.A.C's own manual by saying that the officer controlled the tone, pace, and subject matter of the online conversations. Okay? And this is something extremely typical. Okay? We hear this all the time. All the time. These blurring of legal and ethical lines. All right? This was followed up a year later. How law enforcement turns law-abiding men into sexual predators. And, well, not really, actually, about 6 months later, July 2025, where they attempted to get public records and the police stonewalled, arguing that these are active cases and that they were not the public was not entitled to know what's going on, which is interesting because Sheriff Grady had no problem blasting the name and address and picture out there. But where it calls into question his tactics, he is not interested in coming clean on them, which might suggest that that would be something that the defense attorneys would need for their defense, but that the sheriff refuses to provide that as a matter of course, exculpatory evidence, including a methodology that police use. Okay? And this is some of the ways officers violate the rules to boost arrest totals. Folks, haven't we said over and over again that they get paid for the arrests? That's exactly what's happening. Okay? And they do made-for-TV press conferences. But while law enforcement have denied any widespread issues with the operations, and in their investigations, there's a pattern of officer misconduct and an effort to boost arrest totals. And it was apparent that this went on for many, many years. Okay? They arrested far fewer men than had become routine once they put the pressure on law enforcement to prove things. Okay? The DOJ actually launched a review of the Central Florida's I.C.A.C task force, but it is unclear whether that review actually came across with anything meaningful. Now, again, this is 2019, okay? But law enforcement agents stymie some of 10 investigates questions and record requests, citing that it's overly broad public records exemption as their excuse. Again, we've seen this over and over again. They refuse to provide the records here as well, and you have to fight them tooth and nail to get anything. When they did get limited records by going to court and obtaining them, they found, for example, that there was not much evidence to support the statement that these men were online to look for children. Okay? Very, very thin evidence. Furthermore, the police were using Florida's Contraband Forfeiture Asset Act to seize property as their own of anybody even accused of committing a felony, even if they won their case, these defendants, even if they were acquitted and won their case, even if it was dismissed, they still kept the property. This is a rich source of revenue, seizures, etc., from a very generous Florida law, even though sometime later, I believe in 2018, there will be the Timms v. Arizona case before the U.S. Supreme Court, where Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, writing for the majority, said that the Eighth Amendment of unreasonable searches and seizures, of which this would be the type, is certainly applies to the states as well. So it's entirely likely that they had to curb that also. Okay. But again, they're not honest with their numbers as well. And this is something that comes out here in this article, which talks about a number of people being arrested, including through various deceptions. So they were called names by the Sheriff Grady, called sexual predator, traveling to meet a minor. But here's an example of a 27-year-old Cape Coral man arrested by Lee County Sheriff's Department the previous May, a couple months before. He didn't travel to meet a child for sex. Officers responded to the man's casual encounters. This is back when Craigslist casual encounters was a thing. They pretended to be a 14-year-old girl, even though the ad clearly asked for age of all women must be 18 plus. No one under that email me, please. And they still did it. The man repeatedly told them he was not okay with meeting up with an underage girl, but because he did not immediately end the conversation, he was arrested for utilizing his phone to solicit a sexual act. Disgraceful. Detectives went to his house and arrested him as a sexual predator of children. In another case, they suggested that this man was right here in 2020. Years later, when they arrested him, they claimed that pictures that he supposedly had on his phone, Edgardo Cancela, were of his own small children. We've talked about that. Police routinely say, here's Sheriff Grady right here, that they routinely say that, hey, if you have children in the home, we rescued them too, which is, of course, nonsense. There's no evidence of that. So this man, Edgardo Cancela, hopefully I'm saying it right, was arrested for possessing child porn in 2020, linked to his phone, okay, as part of Operation Guardians of Innocence 5 back in November 2019. Pay attention to this, trolls. After months of investigation, deputies said that Cancela, who lived in Davenport with his wife and two kids, supposedly possessed and promoted child porn. Investigators explain, see, here's his mugshot. He's got his jail uniform on, right? Investigators explained that he was using a Facebook user profile of Austin Rose. He uploaded images and videos of child porn. Okay. Well, Cancela got out of prison and filed, along with his wife, against Sheriff Judd that there's no evidence there on his phone or when they conducted a search warrant on the couple's property. Their children also told investigators that they had not been harmed, but that didn't stop the sheriff. The lawsuit says that Kinsella and his family stopped using that cell phone number by 2018, around a year before he was arrested, according to the Nick Mick tip. So it's entirely conceivable that this was a phone number that he no longer possessed. However, during the search, when Kinsella, who understood his rights and refused to provide a passcode to unlock his phone, which he does not have to do, as far as I know, I believe there's a Supreme Court ruling around this time where the Supreme Court said you cannot be compelled to open your phone giving the passcode. He asked to call his lawyer first to confirm that it was okay to do so, and they arrested him on child porn charges. Now, why would you do that? Why would you do that? Well, presumably you got to get your arrest numbers up, so that would be the reason, and then you clean up the mess later. Meanwhile, you deny this man his ability to call his lawyer and ask a question about whether this was legal or not. Okay, following arrest, of course, Grady Judd rushed to a podium and to a microphone, distributing Kinsella's name, address to the local media, and called him every name in the book. Kinsella, as many of us were put on suicide watch, and he was not, when he was released from jail on bail, Kinsella was not allowed to see his wife and children, nor was he allowed to live under the same roof, according to the lawsuit. Court records show that it was dismissed, and ultimately all charges dropped later that year. But the lawsuit accuses Jones of false arrest, malicious prosecution, and defamation. It is, I believe, still proceeding. Many of the charges were removed against the judge. I think there were 11 charges. 9 were removed by the judge against Grady, claiming that there was still probable cause. And again, you can drive a Mack truck through the allowances of police that they can arrest you for quote unquote probable cause. Kinsella's case is dismissed. The lawsuit against Grady, I think, is still proceeding through, but Grady's never been held fully accountable on these matters. There was another case in 2011, I think. There was a woman who was in charge of an atheist organization in Central Florida, and she took umbrage with Sheriff Grady taking basketball court hoops out of the prisons. There, as in some jurisdictions here in Virginia, the sheriff runs not only is the local law enforcement, but also runs the court and also runs the local jail. That happens out here in Loudoun County. However, in Prince William and Fairfax County, the sheriff simply runs the court and the adjoining jail complex. Okay, not so down there. So this woman was very annoyed that basketball hoops designed for people in jail for their recreation, keep them busy, were taken out. Sheriff Grady at the time said that they were taken out because, quote, that prison is not about having fun, or jail is not about having fun. Certainly it isn't, but you also don't want to create a riot from people who have nothing to do. He then turned around, being the very religious man he is, an Anabaptist, and turned around and gave those hoops to local churches, which created ire among the atheist group. The atheist woman who's head of that group went after the sheriff, and he retaliated against her by having her arrested, apparently for this bizarre case. She supposedly was simulating sex sounds outside her window. Actually, it reverberated outside her window, and a father and his son heard it, but she was in her private space at the time. Regardless of the case, it's interesting that Sheriff Grady argued later that this was simply a woman who wanted to get attention. Again, a very strange thing for a man who's never seen a microphone, a podium, or a camera that he couldn't fling himself in front of to proclaim the pedophiles of the day that he captured. A number of cases are still pending. Many have been, some, I should say, have been dismissed. But that has more to do with the fact that it is clear that evidence is being tampered with, that the sheriff is not above board on his methodologies, that he is, in fact, according to the evidence that they have been able to gain through the media, through a lot of hard struggle, that Sheriff Grady is not sitting back and waiting for things to happen. That many of the people caught in his stings are not looking for children as he claims. And if we could see the full chats, we'd probably see that police officers have a script where they are actually beginning the conversation. They are approaching, they are talking about sex as they've done in my case, as they've done in other cases in the past where they make the approach. And why do they do this? Why do they do this in proactive stings where they claim they're just sitting back here waiting for something to happen? When there are many reactive cases in Polk County and other places where there are real human trafficking situations. And Sheriff Grady certainly has been involved in those, and kudos to him. But in order to who were not who were actually going after children, how many were the proactive ones that showed no interest in children versus the ones that did? When they start investigating and put pressure on the sheriff, the numbers seem to come more in line to what we have been seeing, namely that they are inflating their numbers for I.C.A.C funding and for civil asset forfeiture in the history of Shady Grady's dubious stings. This is I.C.A.C Unpacked for Norman and Michael Have a good day.